Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Today's guest is another one who knows up close and personal that I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. Makes going out for dinner at conferences a bit challenging, I have to admit, but I'm sure he would agree that those who are new to this webcast should be aware of this and not is not a safe space for those who are either easily offended by our satire or by having their ideas challenged. My name is Don Vino. This is July 2019, and broadcast number 151. This week, we are joined by Dan Guinn, founder of Francis Schaeffer Studies, to talk about doubt in truth, doubt and apologetics, truth, reality, and the battle for the mind. And my name is still Don Vino. I'm reading down the page here. I'm realizing I got ahead of myself, Ron, as I do sometimes.
You got ahead of yourself.
Well, I got ahead, and here's my head, and I head
and
in
you
almost,
the wrong direction. As long as you don't turn left, you're okay.
You can turn left, I'm good, yeah. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast and hopefully keep me in line.
Oh, that's I depend on your wife for that. Okay. Greetings from sunny Florida. Where this palm? Well, it's actually not that sunny today, but the palm tree came out, saw a shadow. Now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors for this webcast include Jack's General Deconstruction, subverting the best to palm off the rest since 1966. Jack's General Deconstruction and the Heresy Conservation Board, ensuring. I'm having trouble with consonants today. Ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond. And if you enjoy this webcast, or if it really bothers you and you want to inflict it upon others, to ensure your continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. So, I was running a little late, and I was beginning to doubt whether I was going to be here on time. So, and I thought, how appropriate, since our topic is doubt.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's like, do I doubt like my own existence? What if nothing exists and everything is just an illusion? In that case, I definitely overpaid for my carpet, as Woody Allen once said. So here we are, and we're talking about doubt. Let's talk about it. What do we say about this?
Yeah, it could be doubtful that if we don't start on it, that to be doubtful that we have an actual relevant program by the time we're done. Dan Guinn, share with us a little bit about Francis Schaeffer Studies. What is it, and why were you attracted to it? Let's start there.
Yeah, so basically January 1st of 2011, so 1111111, all the ones, we started Francis Schaeffer Studies, and it was basically a desire to create a website where we'd have a resource for the works of Dr. Schaeffer and his wife Edith. And so because we couldn't find a complete comprehensive site out there, the other aspect of that is also to engage people with Schaeffer's thought on social media, which in our mind is where the public square is today. You might not find people discoursing deep thought and philosophy and theology in the public square in downtown, but you will find them doing it pretty heavily online and social media. And so that's where we wanted to bring Dr. Schaeffer's thought, because we felt like it's a natural fit. So we started that and then began to do various things. We had already began to teach various classes at our church on Schaeffer's works, me in particular teaching quite a few classes on different things like his work, True Spirituality, and several of them like Mark of a Christian, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's been quite a wonderful thing. We've also traveled travel to various Labrie conferences and do what we call conference coverage. We also collect Schaeffer artifacts and things that are related to Schaeffer's life, so included historic photos and
Are these like
things like that.
Schaeffer relics? Are you establishing like a relic repository where we can all pray?
Yes,
put in some money.
Like,
And
you're welcome to come over anytime.
like a finger bone or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, we
well, how many of these
actually,
whiskers do you have so far?
I don't have a single whisker. Can you believe that?
Very difficult to believe.
I do happen to know that one seminary has Schaeffer's hairbrush.
Oh,
And that's the truth. I'm not kidding.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt you're kidding. I have no doubt about
That's
that.
good that you're not doubting.
I'm not doubting. Yes. So yeah. Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So part of that though is when we have those artifacts is basically to try to collect and study. So we have every copy of his works, different versions of when they're published, different photographs from different events, tours, etc. And so that's just kind of all part of our Francis Schaeffer studies, if you will, being sort of a resource that we continue to do a lot of things like that. Traveling to the conferences and attending, kind of seeing what the pulse is in regard to what's going on with Labrie is always wonderful. Have great support there, and sometimes attending Covenant Seminary for conferences there at the Francis Schaeffer Institute. Shout out to Mark Ryan there in particular, who is a great supporter of what we do. And then occasionally I get to hang out with my guys at ISCA. So as some of you know, I'm on the board of ISCA as a treasurer. They thought because I'm a programmer, I might be good with math. And so I balance the books there. And then I get to present a paper each year. And so the topic this year was Dr. Francis Schaeffer on doubt in the scope of the work of apologetics. And that's really why I'm here with you today.
Okay, I was busy telling jokes on the on the chat area.
Very nice.
Yeah, well, we do have a following. I don't know why they're following us, but they maybe because they like our humor. But so our my good friend Dr. Norm Geisler passed away this week. It does not affect us directly, but maybe indirectly, because Norm Geisler has been around doing a defense of the faith for 70 years and has impacted a lot of lives. That would mean that he was out there working on many of these issues in his younger years at the same time Francis Schaeffer was working on giving answers to unbelievers and training believers.
Yeah.
What was I know what the impetus was for Norm as a new believer. He was challenged with an answer. He tells a story of being challenged by a drunk from a passage where Jesus says, "Go and tell no man," and he didn't really know how to respond. So he thought he needed to get answers to that. What was it that caused Francis Schaeffer to start down the road of looking for answers and then ultimately dealing with the question of doubts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on in his career, he was, prior to his career, early on in his life, he was an agnostic. He really didn't know. He attended a liberal church at the time, but they weren't really preaching the gospel, so he was kind of confused about reality and about the nature of things and spirituality for that matter. And so then what happened is one day he actually encountered a book that was on philosophy. It was actually an accident. Like this, you would think that these kind of accidents are providential, because for him, this book that he got on Greek mythology and Greek philosophy actually spurred him to study questions. And as he began to study the questions, he decided, well, what do I believe? And then he started to think about, well, wait a second, I go to church where they talk about this Bible, but they never really get into anything succinct in regard to it. And so then he decided to read it cover to cover just for honesty's sake. And out of honesty, then he eventually came to faith. And so I think for him, that's how it started early. I think later on, with the questions of the battles of life, he went through a period in the 50s where he, even after being a pastor in the States for some 10 years, he struggled with his faith. He had a real crisis of faith, constantly, because not really understanding um, the reality of how you could have troubles in this life, have real succinct things going on in your life that are troubling, and even have attitudes about your faith where you're defending the faith for the sake of being right rather than being true to your gospel. And so that true spirituality that came out of that became the motivation for a lot of his ministry, and it formed many thoughts where he dealt with questions and people that had doubts. So he was a doubt professional, if you will, when
he was a veteran.
Came to
a veteran of doubt. I understand one of the big elements of his personal crisis that led him to eventually write True Spirituality was just dealing with some of the very unloving Christians that he encountered. I think maybe especially after he returned on furlough.
1954 it was dealing with so much of the modern separatist movement at that time, or post the kind of the separatist modernist movement. There were a separation of
McIntyre.
Let's
not name names.
Let's not name names.
Well, except there's this one guy. His first name begins with C. Okay. Well, anyways, there were a lot of unloving people, and I have to think that now if he spent like 5 minutes on social media these days, he'd probably run to the nearest mountaintop in Switzerland and jump off. I mean,
there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of those who will burn you on the internet. It can be an unloving environment.
You think there's unloving people in the local church? Where do you get online? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, you can name names. I just finished an interesting book about a month ago called The Fundamentalist, kind of dealing with the separation and the battles between the fundamentalists and neo-evangelicals, and how some of them even kind of moved back and forth as they're trying to figure out what does separation mean, to what extent do we separate, and those kinds of questions. So Schaeffer probably ran into that whole battle that was going on at the time.
And I think the other thing that is important to understand is that, and it's not as heavily documented at times. You have to kind of really have been sort of steeped in Schaeffer history before you kind of get into the depth of it. But Dr. Schaeffer himself dealt with times of depression, and depression and doubt are often linked together in many ways, especially for the Christian, I believe, because one impacts the other, and sometimes it can be have a cyclical type of thing. And so Schaeffer found that the resolution of his depression was to focus on the truth as opposed to doubts, but focus on ministering to his heart and soul with the truths of Scripture, the truths of the reality that God has made, and taking stock in what Scripture says. So for him, it was kind of part of his being to deal with doubts. It was something that he dealt with personally, but then also dealt with it. If you read his letters, he answers a lot of questions about people struggling with various issues in so many different areas.
I understand that he was frequently overheard when people would, like at a conference, somebody might come up to him and say, I have this problem in my life. And he would say, yeah, I have the same problem too. Now we know, I mean, sadly, we've come to know a lot about the personal aspect of his problems thanks to his, I don't know how to put this, but his oversharing son, Frank, in his book Crazy for God. I'm going to try to be really kind to this person. I was going to say gentleman. I'm not going to.
Individual. How about this? Individual.
Yeah. I've really, when I think of what he wrote about his parents, I just cringe. Not that this should necessarily be hidden, but it's the manner and the purpose for which he shared the information has more to do with his own headlong plunge into apostasy from the Christian faith than it does serving any real good biographical purpose, in my opinion. But yeah, we know here was a guy who, life was hard, and his marriage wasn't the best, from what we now know. I mean, they stayed together, and there's no doubt they loved each other, but there were issues. And
yeah, I'm thoroughly convinced that some of that is hyperbolic. But I know that one of the things that you'll hear if you, like for example, Bruce Little at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary at the Francis Schaeffer Collection did an interview with Randall McCulley, and that's one of the things he brought up with Randall is what about Frankie? And so and Randall, I think, dealt with the question very well, explained it's the family dimension, this issue, and I always when people ask me that question, I usually refer them to that interview and also to read the interview with Oz Guinness.
mm-hmm.
And in general, though, I mean, we get that context of what was going on. Some of that may be more extreme than it really was, because the other dynamic that we constantly have from both him and Edith is how much they dearly loved each other.
Yeah.
And dearly had a solid relationship. I mean, Edith talks about them staying up in the middle of the night after ministering and doing various things, and Francis resting his head on her lap and just relaxing while she reads him her writing from the tapestry. That's not a broken relationship. That's one that is really close, that has given each other a lot of latitude, and because recognizing that we're fallen sinful people. So it's not the sense I get from reading the history or anything that Edith put forward.
And another thing that Schaeffer faced going into the 70s, especially, was maybe even before then. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but he was attacked by other Christians as being a pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-scholar. I think some of that came out of Calvin College in Grand Rapids. Some of it, there was a scholar named James Barr, Scottish scholar, who flat out called him a pseudo-intellectual. And there's a recent historian, I think her name is Mary Worthen, who wrote who basically repeats. I mean, she was not even born yet, I think when Schaeffer, I'm not sure she was born when Schaeffer died even. Maybe she was. But did I get the name right? You must be aware of all these things.
I'm not aware of her, but I am aware of some of the other stuff.
She wrote. I hope I didn't misquote her or misname her, but there was a church historian, female church historian, who basically repeated these criticisms with, and when she did, there was a response from the people who had really been helped by Schaeffer over the years, including Doug Groothuis. Groothuis? Am I pronouncing it? Yeah, I mean, he came out, I mean, he was very gentle in his response. But, you know, I've known many people who have been to L'Abri either in the States or in Switzerland, and some of them spent a significant amount of time with Francis Schaeffer himself. And one thing he did not consider himself, as I understand it, he didn't really consider himself to be an intellectual. He didn't consider himself to be, he said he didn't even really consider himself to be an apologist so much as an evangelist.
Yeah, that distinction, I think, points to something of his methodology. You know, he was not concerned with being a classroom apologist. He was a type of apologist that was in the rough and tumble way of things. And one of the things that he describes is, he describes it like walking through the mud. You're not going to deal with these real life struggles with real people in the clean classroom, cut and dried methodology. You're going to deal with it in a very muddy, a very sometimes disorganized and even a messy type setting. I mean, and it's well known that, you know, he had people sometimes visit his home and then light up and smoke marijuana in his living room. I mean, so you know, or people doing other things, various other things in his house. Every piece of wedding, every single wedding gift that they ever received were destroyed during their time of ministry by having people in their home. So that's not the kind of clean cut academic environment of apologetics, but it was the rough and tumble type. And Schaeffer learned a lot from both dealing with people and the current way that they were thinking, and also studying alongside them and studying these various schools. So what's interesting, though, is when I hear some people picking on his apologetics from certain perspectives and saying, well, he's not an academic. He's not an academic in the formal sense, but you can go and read historically at the time and find various people who were saying, especially on the secular side, who were saying the exact same perspectives that Schaeffer were saying at the time. So it's not like it's disconnected, like he's just making this stuff up. He really is kind of using things as he understood them by dealing with the real world. And so whether those people may or may not have been exactly right either is always something that will be suspect in that type of environment.
So you're raising, to me, an important issue. Of course, I'm personally invested in this particular issue, and because it's something that Dr. Geisler and I had frequent discussions about. Like Schaeffer, I'm not a classroom academic apologist. I am what Norm and I called a street fighter. I hang around with witches and, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. I have people over here that you normally would not invite to a fine Christian home, and you know, so we meet kind of at street level on these issues. Does that mean, though, that we have less to offer? Norm believed that we had as much to offer as a classroom apologist. I like that, a classroom apologist. I think that's a good distinction. So there's a lot to be offered from both sides of the fence. And I don't think we can really negate one or the other and say one is more valuable than the other, because God uses us all in spite of ourselves, really.
Yeah, and Dr. Schaeffer was academically trained. It wasn't like that he was disconnected from that. And so some of the criticisms too, like, you know, and we mentioned Dr. Geisler, and I remember when I first met him, he recognized that I was, doing Francis Schaeffer work and all this. I wanted to find out about that, and as I was talking with him, and he's told me two things very, very flatly, which I thought was quite wonderful from him. He's like, number one, Schaeffer was a prophet. His works were prophetic, basically, is what he said. And then number two, he was wrong about. You can guess. Can you guess who it is? He was wrong about Aquinas.
Yeah. Well,
And so,
and that traces back to his days at Westminster Seminary.
Exactly. That goes back to his time under Van Til. But I think the beauty of that, though, is there needs to be proper open exchange and viewing our scholars, our leaders in an honest way. And our guiding verse is from Hebrews. Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life, and this is most importantly, imitate their faith. And so, what I am truly, hoping to do with Francis Schaeffer Studies is to continue to try to imitate Dr. Schaeffer's faith. And you say, well, if he's so flawed as he's dealing with this, then what is so endearing about that? But I think the very thing that is endearing about Schaeffer is that he is human.
If people only knew some of the biographies of some of their favorite philosophers, they would run back to Schaeffer. It's like when come on, you've got to be kidding me. You're first of all, when it comes to much of the information, I'm just going to say it, consider the source. And secondly, I'm not even going to go, I'm not even going to talk about some of the stuff that even some major liberal theologians were involved in. I'll just mention a couple. I'll mention one. Karl Barth kept a mistress for most of his career. Okay. And it was an open secret. So, people, it just kind of emerged, in the last few years through various online sources, and some devoted Barthians, were apoplectic over it, So, let's put it in perspective. Yeah, he was a flawed person. He had feet of clay like the rest of us. But let's compare to a lot of people, you could do a lot worse.
Uh-huh. And then I think, along with that, Schaeffer was earnest of owning up to where, for example, he viewed doubt as sin, specifically when you were talking about in the specific area of doubt as doubting God, doubting God's truths, but at the same time, also enforced or moved into this notion of taking the fall seriously, that we are not just people that are in a clean environment here. We've got the deck stacked against us, so to speak. We're working with the various hardships that we're trying to deal with respect to how that we're in a fallen world. We're trying to fight for truth, but yet also trying to maintain our own mental state at the same time. This position of truth that we need to have to hold the historic Christian position, if you will, and then also acknowledge the testimony that's going on both internally as well as externally when we look at the world itself, should be building us up and should be nurturing us. And that's what Schaeffer wanted us to understand.
One of the things that I want to, because it is time for us to do a break. We've run slightly over, but the whole question of doubt, that's a big question. But how would you even know that anything is true? How would you know that you can understand anything actually?
Well, maybe what you really need is someone to show you why, it doesn't matter, maybe to deconstruct everything. So, that's why we have our sponsor today. And we have some questions here. What is truth? Sometimes you just feel like your world is being turned upside down. So we have some questions. Are you having difficulty living according to your worldview? Do you need expert professional help to get reality to conform to your presuppositions? Sometimes do you feel like you don't know Jack? Well, then you need to call Jack. Jack Jack's general deconstruction. All Jack's work comes with free logocentrism inspection, free binary opposite inversion, and free destabilization of textual meaning. Now you can have the reality that suits you. Subverting the best to palm off the rest since 1966. Jack's general deconstruction. Now, notice that date, 1966. That's when Jack Derrida went to Yale University and gave his first big speech, made his first big splash in the philosophical world. And his name has become indelibly associated with people who deny truth claims, deny, basically everything is up for grabs. And we're talking about the postmodern world. Schaeffer was dealing with a generation that had been schooled in existentialism.
Right.
So, Schaeffer had been dealing with, basically the foundation with existentialism had already been removed. We now say everything is absurd. There is no foundation of truth. So you have to make your own meaning. And Schaeffer said this is going, to just brush with very broad strokes, as I understand Schaeffer. He's saying this is going to lead us into a very bad place. It's only going to, once you do this, it's only going to get worse. Things are going to descend into chaos. That was one of the things he said. And we're not talking about just intellectual chaos, which he was definitely pointing in that direction, but just social chaos, political chaos. Gee, do you think he might have been onto something?
Well,
Yeah.
I think so, and I want to weigh in on this in a second. I just want to mention that someone had asked a question about Van Til versus. Oh, okay. Do you have?
Do you know any
conflation of presuppositionalist of Schaeffer and more than Till Bunsen folk? How might you distinguish between the two philosophies, if you will?
Schaeffer was considered there's a general presuppositionalist camp. Van Til is more or less the North Star, if you will, for most presuppositionalists. And next to him, you have a guy named Gordon Clark. And they differ. They had differences and emphases. And Clark is considered somewhat more of a rationalist. And there were some ecclesiastical conflicts between those two gentlemen. In the meantime, Schaeffer comes along and he studies under Van Til, and doesn't seem to go quite all the way. In terms of method, the general presuppositionalist method of getting, and it was hinted at in that deconstructionist commercial, the Jack's General Deconstruction. Are you having trouble living according to your worldview? If you watch How Should We Then Live, or read the book carefully, that's his constant theme. Can you live according to this worldview that you've made for yourself?
Right.
That's a very presuppositionalist approach. In other words, instead of appealing to evidence, you start with where they are at, and you say, okay, how's it working for you? And can you? And is it really working? Are you really living, or are you borrowing from a Christian worldview in order to get through?
Right.
And the fact is, everybody does.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
if I could speak to that just
please,
very briefly.
Yeah.
And I always joke that there's two questions when you talk about Schaeffer in any sort of theological context. You'll get a question: what about Frankie? And then what about Van Til? So with that, I view Schaeffer as a modified presuppositionalist. Some might say that you could make a case for correspondence as his focal point. There's a couple of other views I think that are valid analysis of his position. He notes at several different times the things that he differentiated with Van Til on. And one of the big ones is that he felt like that with Van Til's position, if you got to a certain point, there was no room to talk. And that's at least that, and that's Schaeffer's words there.
The point of contact, yeah.
Yeah, at the point of contact, that's where he differed, because he felt like that because they were made in God's image and made in God's world, that you could still speak to them, and so therefore the point of contact, although it wasn't a level playing ground, it was at least where we could call them at the tension. And that's one of the things. So Schaeffer believed in the evaluation of presuppositions, which is slightly different than the Van Til method. Even though they both use the word presupposition, Schaeffer actually used them in more of a practical traction type way, where I could actually evaluate your presupposition for tension and then push it. And so
I think Van Til would have no problem with that.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
They did correspond with each other, and Van Til took issues with certain things in Schaeffer's books before Van Til died. Well, I mean, I think Van Til lived longer than Schaeffer did, actually. So, anyways, yeah, they weren't on the same page completely, but in terms of the importance of presuppositions, they shared a lot, and
And supposedly, too, if you read it in this area, that they actually met at one point again to discuss this matter. And so Van Til kind of got after Dr. Schaeffer just a little bit, but then laid out this wonderful exposition. And at the end of it, Schaeffer says, that has to be one of the greatest explanations of the gospel and apologetics I've ever heard. And so, there was a tremendous respect there, and Schaeffer never wanted to have a war with Van Til, because obviously Van Til was a master polemicist, if you will. And so that could have been a thing that really would have been a poor detriment. And so I think that,
now, one of the things that I have noticed over the years is that it usually isn't let's say the big names, Schaeffer, Geisler, Van Til, that are the issue. They each have their own sort of view of the mechanics of the faith, how does God do stuff, or methodologies and how to evangelize. It seems to be their acolytes that become more problematic, because it's almost like, okay, Schaeffer is a divinely inspired way to do apologetics, or Van Til, or whoever. And so they have battles amongst the followers of different teachers. Now, I want to go back. Having said that, we tend to, Ron and I don't even agree on a number of things. And
I do know how to turn left in my car.
Yes, he does. That is true. Yeah, which helps when we're traveling. I let him drive.
Yeah.
What we really come back to, I think, is what we originally started with in our webcast today, is dealing with doubts. In fact, before we started, Dan and I were talking a little bit, because there are some who would say to even have a doubt is sinful. And Francis Schaeffer took a view similar to that, which he can speak to. But then you also have situations where maybe having doubt isn't sinful. Abraham, for example, is told by God, look, I'm going to wipe out the city. And he goes, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about this. What if I find 50 righteous people? Would you spare the city? And kind of negotiated with him on that.
Haggled with him
over it. And is there some kind of doubt as to how much God had to give on that from Abraham? Or Elijah runs and hides in a cave after this tremendous defeat of the false prophets of Baal. How does God deal with that? So maybe you want to land on that and define, okay, what do we mean by doubt? How does apologetics interact with that? And then the subtitle is Truth, Reality, and the battle for the mind.
Yeah, well, I'd say that, like, in my paper, I start off with the several examples that you have from Schaeffer talking about doubt, where he identifies it specifically as sin, but he's talking about a specific type of doubt where you're doubting the truths of the faith, or in this case, for example, he deals with Eve. I think we'd all believe that Eve fell and sinned. That's a foundational understanding of our faith. It's also the aspect of the question of Thomas. He deals with doubting Thomas. Yet he also shows how that God even used Thomas's doubt to bring about a better explanation from Christ about the truths of our faith. So doubt has its works in providence to bring about tremendous things as well. God will use sin and the fallen world for his purposes. If you think about Abraham too, I mean, I always point to this one, is that, in the Hall of Faith, you have Abraham believed God, and of course it was counted to him for righteousness. But then what would happen if he didn't believe God? Well, we have to assume that would be the opposite, that would be unrighteous. But to your point, though, that there is an area where that we can discourse with God, and we can that there are things that aren't explicitly sinful. But I think Schaeffer's overall point in this, and what I try to bring out in the paper, is to emphasize that in the very base, when we doubt God, when we doubt the truths of our faith, then we are being in sin. But that is also the context of the fallen world. So the people around us also doubt God. They sin daily, thought, word, deed. We also slip into acting like we are not quite believers. One illustration that I put toward the end of the paper is an illustration of the two chairs. He says sometimes you sit in the chair of spirituality, where you think, okay, that's how you ought to do it. But then there's times when you are over here and you are not believing God, so you sit in the chair of unfaith, as he calls it, the chair of unfaith, which is ultimately unfaithful, which is also sinful. So sometimes I think we regularly fall into that because of the fallen state. It's not necessarily an implicit sinful action necessarily, but sometimes we fall into these things. And so again, Schaeffer was about taking the fall seriously. So then what's the prescription? Well, then we begin to turn to the truths, and not just leave them there, but also take it to another level where we begin to apply them also with the spiritual devotion that's needed to take it seriously. And I bring this out in the paper, and I think that would be a tremendous thing. If you're struggling with that area at all, I think this will still minister to you as well.
Now, you gave that paper at our just past EMNR/ISCA conference, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So if anyone wanted either a print copy of that, or if they want to listen to the audio, they could contact us for that, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the status is on the audio, but the paper itself is available on francisschaefferstudies.org. And at the top, I've added a section just called Papers, and you click there, and there's only one listed right now, but there's a bunch of others I'll be adding soon from past years.
Now,
all right, so they could email you, right? And where would they do that?
You can Dan at francisschaefferstudies.org will work.
Okay, so they could contact you and say, how do I get that? I know that we're uploading, it could take a while, but we're uploading all of the talks onto our websites. I imagine you guys can do the same. I think we sent you the link to the folder, so that'll be up to you.
Yeah.
Now, my first contact with Francis Schaeffer came just by turning on the radio in 1976, I think it was.
Interesting.
There was Moody Radio in Chicago.
Very familiar with those.
Yeah, they were airing his lectures from L'Abri. And
I would say, by the way, that you can purchase those now.
Well, where? I would like to.
So I think it's think it's under another group. I don't remember right off the top of my head, but I have them. I've purchased them.
Okay, yeah, let me know.
Yeah.
I'd like to get them because
Right,
I mean, this was my first. I was a new Christian. I had just become a Christian like 6 months earlier, and I remember on the bus on my way to school one day. I was in high school still. My best friend said, that his grandmother listened to Moody Radio. I go, "What's that?" And he tells me, "Okay, it's a Christian station." So I found it. I tuned in, and I was hooked. From that point on, because I was just soaking it all in. And so I would just, instead of, it used to be the rock and roll stations, that I was listening to, and now I'm switching over to this Christian Moody Bible Institute radio. And I remember on Saturday hearing this, it just grabbed me, his lectures. Yeah. He's talking way over my head, and so I want to understand it. And then I find out about this book. I went to my local Christian. Well, my local Christian bookstore wasn't that local. I had to drive from Bolingbrook to Naperville. You know about how long that drive is, Don. So anyway, yeah, it's well back then, I think the first one was the little skinny one. What was it? Escape from Reason.
Escape from Reason, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one you got to go. I mean, if you're in high school, that's the ideal length, of a book. If you're a new Christian and you're trying to absorb this stuff,
that's a brief fire hose spray.
And Frankie himself, Frankie wonderful. Says, I think he saw was Keith Richards was carrying a copy of it from the Rolling Stones. I mean, this was something. This became kind of a.
And Eric Clapton too.
Eric Clapton. Yeah. These guys were reading this book. I was shocked to hear this decades later.
Yeah.
But it's the one that grabbed me, and then the God Who Is There, and Genesis and Space and Time, and all that. And
what's wonderful, I would have to say about those Moody lectures, if anybody could get a hold of them, is they, I guess, and especially wonderful for me as someone who is considers himself somewhat of a Schaeffer historian. I study a lot about him, and it's wonderful to actually hear him. It's as if you're sitting down with him and you're hearing him explaining it in his own words. And he does a wonderful job. And then there's this kind of discourse sometimes of answering questions from John Sandry.
People in the audience,
Yeah, people in the audience sending things in. So it's really quite wonderful. And it's really great too.
In the introduction to each broadcast, there was this fellow who, it was just recorded, it was repeated every broadcast, that the truths of the Christian faith, he said, were subject to verification. Now this is an area where, Van Til might not want to say it that way, but just the idea, it gets back to the question, why do we doubt? And when you say something like that, the Christian faith is subject to verification, what you're saying is it's not irrational to believe. It's not irrational to believe the Christian faith. Whether you agree exactly on the process and how the apologetics should be carried out, we'll put that to the side for a moment. One of the reasons we doubt is because the world keeps telling us, you believe in this irrational thing. What you believe in is like Mother Goose. It's fairy tales. It's irrational. It's for children. And that sometimes sounds compelling to the sinful side of us, to the unbelieving side, the remnants of sin that we carry around in us. And so this causes doubts. This causes our faith to be troubled. And we need to hear, and this is one of the great things that I think evidentialist apologetics do for the church, is that they show us that no, it's not totally irrational to believe. There are rational reasons for faith. You're not, going out on a whim.
And I think we have to acknowledge Van Til's concern, obviously, that if it's subject to human verification alone, then that's the that's not sufficient. But the other side of it, though, is that because the very nature of how God has revealed things has been put in a place where we can perceive it. We should understand that that's part of God's design, that we can verify and think. And so that also comes to the other classification that sometimes Schaeffer gets put into, is the verificationist classification of apologetics. But what I think is really a big, just enormous point to understand with respect to Schaeffer, especially in this area. And I'll read you a quote from the paper, but it's just one line. But to me, this sums up the enormous nature of what Schaeffer is trying to do. He says, men must know that with integrity, we have faced the dark path they are treading. You read it one more time.
Yeah.
Men must know that with integrity, we have faced the dark path they are treading.
They are treading.
They are treading.
Yeah.
Because we have to face those same doubts too. We have to face that same reality. We have to face that same turmoil, the same destructive forces at work. And we say we have truth, but how does that, is that truth doing the sufficient things for us? Are we being honest about those things?
Right.
And are we seeing with that dark path? We suddenly begin to see that compassion is one of the most powerful forces of apologetics.
That is a really important point, and I think many apologists miss that because they're so intent on winning an argument for the right motives. I mean, they want to see people come to the faith, but their focus tends to be on winning the argument rather than speaking to whatever the issue is at heart level with the individual.
And this is where Schaeffer's Mark of a Christian book comes in, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. It's a wonderful thing to mention there. And I sometimes I've taught this at different points, and I said, there's more wrong done in the name of being right in our world than we'll ever know, especially in apologetics. We have to be mindful of that. The name of being right, that's not what we're going for. We're not. It's not all about being right, because I could win an argument and lose the person.
And the basic premise of the Mark of a Christian is by this shall men know that you are my disciples, that you love.
Yeah, the Mark of a Christian.
Right.
Yeah, you love one another, but and it's I always sum up that book by saying it's kind of a melding of what Schaeffer has reported to have said about it in a lecture. Truth without love is ugly, and love without truth is compromise. And so we're always balancing those things.
Truth without love is love without truth is, well, there's another statement.
Okay.
Love without truth is hypocrisy. Truth without love is brutality. So that's the one I heard from Warren Wiersbe, by the way, Moody, who just passed away a few weeks ago.
It's interesting. I grew up as an atheist, and so my process was, at one point when I was finally challenged, I realized that I would, based on the evidence that I was looking at, that I couldn't be honest and an atheist. I couldn't know God doesn't exist somewhere. And so that kind of started me on a process of other questions and answers and resolving doubts and conflict. Over the years, as I have grown in the faith and become engaged in defense of the faith inside and outside the church, it's on both fronts, really.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to the realization that sometimes the doubts that people are having, the truth and reality of the faith that they are missing, that is a battle for the mind, come from heresy.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not well biblically trained. And so heresy is a problem.
Right. Yeah. And while Schaeffer spent a lot of his time dealing with, apologetics directed toward the unbelieving world, toward the end of his life especially, he became concerned about one particular heresy, which was the heresy of biblical errancy. That was a big one toward the end of his life. But, there were a lot more. There are a lot more to be concerned about. But the problem is that Well, we've got a sponsor that deals with the problem of heresies, and they want you to know the situation is dire. According to the latest research, at the present rate of consumption, our supply of heresies will be completely depleted by 2050. The consequences will be disastrous. If this happens, most cults will close their doors by the end of the century, and most heretical websites will completely disappear from the internet, not to mention the fact that 75% of what passes as Christian programming will disappear from the airwaves and cable TV. The solution is simple: heresy recycling. Whether you're online, visiting a church, or out at the mall, you can do your part. Always look for the label, the HCB label, the Heresy Conservation Board, ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond. Because a heresy-free world is a terrible thing, don't you think? We would be out of a job. I mean, what would we do? Well, we could just get into the whole apologetics toward atheism business.
Yeah, exactly.
That would probably keep us busy.
And that brings up a point. It would be so much easier if heresy was clearly labeled.
Yeah. And this is one way it kills two birds with one stone.
Instead, we do have doubts, and they come up, and so what is the answer to that? Schaeffer was trying to address that. Our attitude and way of delivering has a lot to do with whether people can resolve the doubts or not.
Mm-hmm. And what I would also say too, that we have to be vigilant, as not only as we're talking to people, but also as for ourselves. I mean, because the spiritual dimension is always there as well. So if we're not being constantly vigilant about what our state of mind are, we can drift or begin casting doubt on things that we're dealing with. And so in order to constantly be vigilant, it's important that we don't have some sort of false triumphalism that Schaeffer warned about, that we can have a true sense that we're fighting a battle that's not with flesh and blood, that it's also dealing with the spiritual aspect, and also the spiritual does touch the mental. That we're supposed to be renewing our mind and casting down vain imaginations. That's part of this whole battle. It's not just one, having the right apologetic arguments and then forgetting about the mind and casting down vain imagination, or not dealing with things honestly, or doing kind of what I like to do mentally, which is divide things. I'm constantly finding that I've divided this little area of my life over here so that God can't touch that, and then I'm doing all these other things here, and it's like, I look pretty good, but I've got this sin right here that I'm not even focusing on. And so that's a lot of what we need to be doing as far as this vigilance. And I encourage people that are engaged in apologetics to be start to be more mindful in these areas, because how many heresies have we seen? And when we actually ourselves, we are struggling with some sort of spirituality or spiritual doubt, that we could also pray like the Father for his child. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief.
Yeah. Invested, one of the things I come back to often, those who listen to us regularly would know this, is when we're talking with someone, we kind of have to figure out what they're invested in. What is holding them into whatever belief that they are involved with? Why are they struggling? Where does the doubt come from? They seem to have a difficulty embracing the truth on particular issues. What is the investment? Is it that they're going to lose face with their friends who are unbelievers? Is it they're going to lose face with their friends who are in church and would view them as even more sinful because they have doubts? Is it that they will lose family if they leave a group like, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormonism? So
how about they'll lose the lifestyle that they've chosen to live?
Absolutely, lose the lifestyle they've chosen to live. So So in even trying to figure out what it is that you need to communicate, you needed to know what is holding them into their belief system.
Exactly.
That's
that's tremendous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just look at the way doubt in the culture has shifted. In the 1970s, going into the 80s, I think doubt, cultural doubt about the facts of Christianity was primarily rationalist doubt. In other words, and there's still a hangover. It's not as though that's gone away. But I guess, we're making the distinction, or I'm making a distinction between modernist and postmodernist doubt. Modernist doubt was about, there was a standard. It was called science.
Right. We may not have agreed on it, but we did agree there was a standard.
We agreed that there had to be truth. The truth had to exist. At least those who agreed with science, who agreed that that was the gold standard of truth, that there was a gold standard of truth. They identified it with science. We identified it with revelation. They almost talked as though science had some kind of independent existence, as if it was not, if it was not the collective perceptions and supposed wisdom of the scientists that we're really talking about, that the fallible human beings. And then along comes postmodernism, and at first many Christians think it's their friend, because postmodernism challenges the objectivity, the alleged infallible objectivity of science. And at first Christians are saying, go postmodernism. Until then we realize, no, postmodernism is going way farther than that. It's challenging whether there is any such thing as truth, as a standard, as is there.
It's fascinating to me. Fascinating to me that you mentioned that, because at the L'Abri conference this past year, there was a man named Frank Stootman, who is a worker at the L'Abri in Australia, but he's also an astrophysicist. And one thing that he points out is that the traditional truth-seeking of science actually is an elixir just as much as Christianity is to postmodernism. So I think it's fascinating that that the shift has gone that far, and that even the science that was originally kind of speaking against Christianity, and may still be in certain areas, the truths of the universe are still speaking against this postmodernism.
Well, what you're seeing now is that science people who still hold to the idea that science provides a foundation for knowledge are just as marginalized as Christians. In other words, you have postmodernists saying things like, well, mathematics is just a white male European construct. Mathematics, you have people saying, that they're already saying in the 80s and 90s that science itself was simply a white male cultural tool of oppression.
I've been hearing some of those rumors, specifically about some of like Eastern countries beginning to call Western science as a kind of that it's got its moorings in.
I'm talking about the critical theory people. I'm talking about basically what we call in cultural Marxism, but really critical theory is probably the better term for the overarching umbrella for all this stuff. That it is this took root in Germany in the 20s, and then it moved to England, where it blossomed in the 60s, and then it came over to the United States in the 80s, and it merges with postmodernism, and it basically says that the rule of thumb is if white males talked about it, then it's oppressive. If it was the consensus of white males, if it was invented by white males, or if white males approve of it, it's oppressive. Okay, and so that's basically the way they find out whether it's oppressive, is to look at the pigmentation and the gender of the person saying it, and then that determines it. So now, you have science, math, all these things. The social sciences, the humanities have already been taken over by this in many small colleges and universities. And now it's trying to move into the STEM, science, technology, and so on. The STEM disciplines. So you basically, the idea now what you're finding is that people in those disciplines, but not exclusively. There's some humanities people who are holding out, some philosophy people. Those people are being called traitors. They're being called bigots if they still hold on to the modernist ideas of, that there is a truth that can be discovered empirically, and that one day, and that if they have this, they retain this belief that one day, when science has fully done its job, we will know everything we need to know about everything. So, and of course, they are hostile to the idea that we still need revelation from God, but they're still clinging to the idea that there is something called truth, or what Schaeffer used to call true truth, which I think is what made him particularly prophetic for our times.
Yeah, because in many ways he saw the kernels, if you will, in existential thought that would lead to postmodernism. Was just fascinating. I mean, there's several places in his works where he recounts interesting stories that mimic this. One where he's talking with a student, and he ends up one of the persons that knew what Schaeffer was talking about. The guy is saying there is no, basically something like there is no reality or this and that, and so the man stood up over his head, was going to pour hot tea over his head. And he also, Schaeffer talks about sitting on Lake Geneva and seeing these two lovers who were existentialists, but they didn't really know how to express themselves because they didn't believe in love. And so I mean, it was just a really foreign type thing, but they were stepped in every way. This gets to Schaeffer's point of tension. In every way, they're stepping outside of reality, stepping outside of. And that's something that we can speak to, because it's obvious. It's obvious that it's not working for them, and so then they'll just, when this one doesn't work, they'll do what Schaeffer says, and they'll replace it with another arbitrary absolute. And so we need to constantly be bringing them to not just doing an arbitrary absolute, but bringing them to replace it with the truth. And that's really our wonderful guiding role.
Well, we are over time, as we often are.
My cat's trying to tell me it's time to go.
My cat, yeah, exactly.
And the cat alarm is working.
Cat alarm, yeah. So, I'm glad you joined us again, because this really is the emphasis of apologetics in many ways, is to answer arguments, to respond to doubts, and to make a defense for what the gospel is, to do it gently and lovingly whenever possible, and sometimes to stand firmly against protagonists that are not putting out legitimate rejections of the faith. My friend the late Jan Moskowitz would often say, honest questions deserve honest answers. Dishonest questions don't deserve any answers. And I think the same is true here. Honest doubts deserve honest answers in order to resolve the doubts that you might come to faith.
Yeah, that's so Sylvester Jacobs would say that about L'Abri. He said, when I went to L'Abri, they told me outright that they would give honest answers to honest questions, but I discovered they would answer dishonest questions as well. And so,
that's good. So, Dan, how do people contact you if they want more information?
So, you can email me, Dan at francisschaefferstudies.org. I also have a personal website, danguinn.com, because I do a lot of other things. Yeah, I am a technologist, but one of the best ways and easiest ways to reach me would be to connect with us on Facebook. There is a Facebook group, so just search for Francis Schaeffer Studies. You'll see the Facebook group and actually Facebook page, but the group is where you get discussion with both scholar and layperson alike. You'll find myself, Dr. Donald Williams, and Jenna Lynn Ellis, and Rives. Almost forgot her last name because she just got married, and a couple other really great guys like James Stroud are all leading that. And so you'll get some wonderful discussions there with these guys.
Okay.
Can we have you back? Can we have you back sometime, Dan?
Yeah, anytime.
Okay.
I love meeting with you guys, and always fun too. Just joking around with Don at every ISCA event. So I'm enjoying that each time because I can't get enough of the guy. So
then you need another Don fix, I tell you.
Yeah. So
buttering me up there. Okay.
All right.
Ron, you want to walk us out of here, baby?
Okay, let's do that. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services come from Chef Hammond Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never, not even once, don't even try, you'll never prove it in a court of law.
Won't happen.
It's gonna happen, buddy.
Guys, if you hold on a second, I am going to say goodbye to everybody else.